Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I am delighted to welcome onto the podcast Brigitte Webster to discuss how the Tudors celebrated Christmas with their food. Brigitte is a qualified teacher of home economics and history, making her the perfect accomplished Tudor housewife. She holds an MA in early modern history from the University of East Anglia and has undertaken research for HRP, which is historical paralysis, appeared alongside Professor Susanna Lipscomb in Walking Tudor England, and is the author of Eating with the Tudors, published in 2023. Her second book, about Tudor gardens, is due to be published in 2027. She is a regular contributor to the magazine Tudor Places, has had articles published for the BBC History magazine, and has featured on various podcasts. Brigitte is also a public speaker and attends to Tudor life in her small 16th century manor, where she creates an authentic Tudor garden surrounding a home furnished with genuine Tudor interior pieces. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the podcast, Brigitte. How are you?
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for having me on. Yeah, I'm fine. Very cold, freezing cold. But hey, that is December the 1st for you. So yeah, no problems.
I mean, no, it really is cold. And we're talking today about how the Tudors celebrated Christmas with their dinner. Obviously, the Christmas period is full of food for us in the 21st century, but it's going to be really interesting to learn how the Tudors, if they differentiated from us today. Could you tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Yeah, love to. Well, as you already said, my name is Brigitte, and I am a food and garden historian and author of the book Eating with the Tudors. I generally focus on the 16th century, but occasionally venture out into the late medieval period and sometimes up to the 17th century. My practical and academic qualifications sometimes leave me to introduce myself as the perfect, accomplished Tudor housewife in the 21st century. And yeah, what else? Well, I might just point out for people to understand later towards the end of this podcast. I live and work from a very small Tudor manor, which we are slowly preserving for, well, generations to enjoy later.
I'm really, really, really jealous.
Yeah, it is actually very stressful. It robs you of every pound and pence you make. But if you are a historian with all your heart and you are prepared to put all your savings, and I mean all your savings and time towards it, then yeah, it's a life. Hopefully it will be a life legacy. I saved this house.
So the first kind of big meal thing for the Tudors is Advent, and could you tell us what Advent was in the Tudor period?
Yeah, certainly. Well, in pre-Reformation England, during a time known as the 40 Days of St. Martin, the Catholic Church actually forbade meat, cheese, milk, and eggs. And for the Tudors, this was a time of spiritual penance, religious devotion, and was the main reason for a prolonged period of abstinence, which we now, of course, know as Advent. And the diet was very simple in those 40 days. Uh, Basically, just vegetable pottages, cereals, beans, and fish. And as so often with those with lots of money, had a wealth of fish to choose from, but the common poor were more likely forced to settle for a rock hard and dried so-called stockfish. So hard that thing was that you actually needed a hammer to make them palatably soft.
Oh, that is awful. That is so
Yeah,
bad.
yeah. I tried it once, and I can assure you it was one of the only things I don't need to try again.
I mean, Advent is hard enough having to give up everything, but like that just feels like a punishment if you're a bit poorer.
Yeah, yeah. It's very hard on the teeth. It's not tasty, but it just I did boil it for hours and hours, as many recipes actually instruct you to do. But it made no absolutely no difference. It got a little bit softer, but just as ghastly.
What food could we expect to see at the Tudor court on Christmas Day?
Obviously, Christmas itself wasn't quite as big of a deal then as it might be today. Um, but the fact that the church's 40 days of fasting ceased finally with Christmas Eve would have certainly called for a huge relief. And the feast on Christmas Day consisted of huge quantities of meat and poultry. Uh, so on Christmas Day, the wealthy mostly entertained family and their social equals, as expected, but it was also considered a day of generosity, and the lord of the manor was expected to throw a feast for his neighbors, his tenants, and also the laborers working on his estate. Now, that sounds all very nice and cozy, and we even tend to think, oh, how lovely. But as bizarre as it might appear to us, those tenant farmer guests were actually expected to bring bearing gifts in form of farm produce or homemade pies. And so effectively, they brought their own food to that feast. And I believe it to them it was more about the privilege to dine in the impressive hall that mattered more than having a lovely cooked food prepared for them. And it's also interesting because generally it's much harder to find out what the common people, the peasants, the poor people ate generally because nobody seems to have thought it important enough to write it down. And it is thanks to accountant books that we know what was actually served up for such feasts, entertaining the local peasantry. And this is where the Tudor times become interesting because it was only during the 16th century that the thorough documentation of Christmas food and food expenses are actually starting to be mentioned in various account books by the nobility. And one classic case, you might have come across it yourself, is the Willoughbys in Warwick, from Warwickshire and in Nottinghamshire. They provide us with one of the most fascinating insights into not just what the nobility and royalty ate for Christmas, but also their servants and the tenants. And it's only through those documents that we learn that tenants were treated to such special Christmas feasts laid on by the lord of the manor, but in return had to bring their own presents in form of produce. And for the Willoughbys, we know that meant mostly poultry, eggs, cheese, fruit, and pies, because the Willoughby account books list those in particular for the Christmas period. But in theory, that is what should have happened. But we can assume that in reality, few landlords remembered their Christian duties and had to constantly be reminded by people like, for instance, Thomas Tasser, who wrote a guidebook on farming in 1557. And he reinforces the duty of the wealthier to extend their hospitality to the poor in order to lessen their hardship in this particular tough time. And yeah, it's actually Ron Hutton, who is a known authority on historic traditions and celebrations, who was able to pinpoint a particular person, namely the mayor of Coventry, Henry Rogers, who in 1570 seems to have been one of those very few who voluntarily followed that call and genuinely kept an open house for all.
How elaborate could Christmas food be in the Tudor period?
Well, basically, Christmas food was meat heavy. It was meat heaven for the rich and the poor. So let's talk about meat first. And with apologies for our vegetarian and vegan friends. So everybody has heard about the famous boar's head. And this was probably one of the most iconic Christmas fare and not to be missed at the table of the nobility. And the boar's head was also associated in particular with Queen's College in Oxford, where it had been an established seasonal tradition since 1341, so going back hundreds of years. And interestingly, it still is very much a Christmas dish in Austria, where I originally come from. It's one of the signature dishes out there still at around that time. But anyway, let's move on to the next very posh, meaty dish that wealthy Tudors could expect to find on their dinner plate. And that was the most luxurious fare to the wealthy, which obviously was venison. Venison could be roasted or baked in a pie. It was certainly every fine household's feasting meat number one. And there are several reasons for that. Venison was a well-respected social marker. If you served venison, you owned or had at least legal access to a deer park, and that in itself signaled status, power, and influence. And A deer park, of course, conveniently also provided exclusive seasonal hunting entertainment at Christmas tide, which once again must have scored highly amongst those influential friends and contacts in high places. But as a food historian, the thing about venison to me is that amongst physicians, venison was actually regarded as a bit problematic, accused of being the cause for depression and hot temper. And when we, for instance, look at Andrew Ward, though, one of the most esteemed Tudor physicians in this age, he agreed that despite all that problem with venison meat, it was still good for Englishmen and fit for a lord's dish. People sometimes ask me which Christmas related food or meat I dislike. And there's just one. It's the famous brawn. Brawn features a lot in contemporary descriptions about Christmas fare, and it was basically a rather salty pickled piece of boar or pork. Later it was more pork because wild boar was actually extinguished quite early on. But it was described by the quite well-known country vicar William Harrison, who wrote a book about England. And he mentions that it was served with mustard, and that basically is, as we know, the equivalent of the Tudors ketchup, mustard with everything. Um, what is also worth mentioning is that brawn was also the most common meaty winter dish found on the tables, not just of the rich, but also the poor alike. So brawn was something that every class enjoyed. And that again is reflected by Andrew Ward, who we've just mentioned. He calls it the usual meat in winter amongst Englishmen. So there we go, very common, very popular amongst all classes. One meat I always need to mention is mince pies, because we all know mince pies and we all know that it was a Tudor tradition already then. But in Tudor times, mince pies were large and they were meat heavy pies with rich spices, nutmeg, mace, cloves, pepper. Also with expensive dried fruit, such as currants, prunes, candied orange or lemon peel, a few egg yolks, fresh wardens. Those are a particular hard type of pear for those who don't know. And now this is where the big difference comes. It also contained veal or mutton mince, and quite big chunks of it. Now, the Tudor mince pies were not just popular around this time of year, Christmas, but you could find them all throughout the year. Sometimes the name changed. For instance, if you ever see the expression Jewits, that's nothing else but mince pies again, and they are divine. So many people are reluctant to give them a go and say, oh, mince pies shouldn't have meat in them. But honestly, they should. They definitely should. And I actually prefer them to the modern version. it was actually the Victorians, funny enough, that completely dropped the meat content and reduced the size to what we are more familiar now, those almost bite-sized little treats. Um, Now, there might be just one other aspect I quickly mentioned before I move on to the next meat. Late medieval mince meat recipes, and that includes mince pies, often come with a case, so-called a coffin crust. You often see coffin crusts mentioned in early recipes, and that was nothing else but a very plain mixture of hot water and flour, and from that they formed the crust. The result was a paste that was basically too hard to eat, uh, and they only consumed the filling. But it was the perfect cooking vessel, and contemporary serving manuals actually advise to cut the top lid off and for people to spoon out the contents onto their plate. Now, the last bit of meat that I think I'm going to mention is clearly the Tudors like their fowl and their poultry at Christmas. Who doesn't? It did grace all tables of the rich and the influential at around Christmas time, and you could expect to see ducks, geese, pheasants, and even the occasional peacock. Um, or if you really wanted to flaunt your wealth, the most prestigious swan. But it was the turkey that was basically, quite literally, the new bird on the block. And it was in the at around 1510. The Duke of Buckingham, the Earl of Northumberland, he is one of the first who we know had turkey served. Not, however, on for Christmas, but at a different feast. But nevertheless, it's important to know that turkey started to be effectively used by the very wealthy in the 16th century, but it took a little bit longer for it to appear on the Christmas table. It we know actually quite a lot about Turkey in Tudor England. We know that it was sold in the markets by the 1540s. We know that by 1555, the price of turkeys was legally fixed in the London market, and people sometimes referred to them also as turkey chickens, so named after the widespread misapprehension that it came from the east via the country of Turkey. But that was indeed the guinea fowl, which was reintroduced to Europe in the 15th century by the ethnically Turkish Mamluks. And it was the Venetian explorer Sebastian Cabot, or Cabot, or however you pronounce his name. He is often credited with having introduced the turkey to England. But sadly, it isn't physically possible as he was only born when they first appeared here in England. So that's one myth cleared here. But what is absolutely certain is that Turkey started to replace the peacock and the swan as a centerpiece at the Christmas fair towards the end of the 16th century, and was often also gifted as a Christmas present. And so, Yeah, I think it was Thomas Tasser who mentions the turkey for Christmas, or a link to Christmas and Turkey in 1577 in his book 500 Points of Good Husbandry. But the one I like, and that's the last turkey, little fun fact. Turkey was also noted as a bribe, and which I find quite funny. Thomas Walmsley and Edward Fenner were guilty of accepting Turkey as a bribe in 1596. Now, I think we've done enough meat. Now, let's see what else came onto the table. There was definitely something called frumenti. And frumenti was a dish of wheat or barley boiled in milk or ale, sometimes enhanced with eggs, dried fruit, spices, and sugar or cream. And it always accompanied venison. It often also appears on the menus of the nobility, as Arnold Richards' Chronicle from 1521 points out, but in a much simpler form and without all those expensive spices. Frumenti also provided a popular dish for the less fortunate in society, who would have served it more likely as a side dish for brawn, as we mentioned before, or possibly sausages. And if we quickly go over to maybe just two sweet dishes, because we all like something sweet on our Christmas table. There is the famous plum pottage. Everybody probably has heard of plum pottage, but it was a Christmas special in Tudor times. But plum pottage later became known as plum pudding. And I think it's the plum pudding that we often hear about. It started life as plum pottage and was originally just a thick broth of mutton or beef, again sweetened with plums, bread, spices, dried fruit, and wine. And it's only during Elizabeth's time that they started to add flour, and it then started to become more of a pudding than a pottage. And yeah, and if you've ever heard of Thomas Nash, a famous Tudor writer, he actually hints at the purgatory effect of this treat. And we know it's true in his Unfortunate Traveller from 1594. So perhaps this is one of the reasons why this dish had completely disappeared by Victorian times. My favorite, all-time favorite Tudor Christmas fare is the figgy pudding. It's a kind of sweet dish made from almonds, wine, figs, raisins, ginger, and honey. And oh boy, that's so good, so nice. Definitely a staple, Christmas staple here in this household. And the last thing I'd like to just mention, not because it was a Tudor dish at Christmas, but people always ask me about it. They say, did the Tudors have Brussels sprouts? What a wonderful question, isn't it? Well, the answer is no. The Tudors did not have Brussels sprouts on their Christmas table, nor did they actually have it on any as part of any other dish, because it simply had not made it to England during the reign of the Tudors. Brussels sprouts are first recorded in 1554 by the Dutch botanist Rembert Doddens, but as I said, they only appear in one Italian recipe by Bartolomeo Scappi in 1570 as new sprouts, but that's it. And it took a good 200 years for Brussels sprouts to move across the continent of Europe to hit England. So definitely no Brussels sprouts.
I mean, I'd be more concerned if have they had the delicacy of roast potatoes.
No, no, they did not have the roast potatoes either. It was fromenti, take it or leave it.
They missed out. They have missed out.
Yeah, but then again, you can't miss what you don't know about. So,
I mean, you think you get a food coma at the end of Christmas Day in this period, but I'd be absolutely knocked out for 2 weeks with all that meat. I'd be...
yeah, it is a lot, isn't it? And I really doubt that they had eaten it all, but it was about showing off. It really was about excess. And to a certain degree, I think this is still the case, isn't it? That we always just prepare way too much and there's leftovers for days to come. So there's something about Christmas that is excessive eating, isn't it?
Now, you said earlier that Christmas wasn't as big in the Tudor period, and they celebrated more New Year's. So, could you tell us a little bit how did the Tudors celebrate the New Year with their feasting?
Yep. Right. Now, New Year's Day, Eve, and New Year's Day were certainly big days in their calendar. And it was also the main day when they exchanged gifts. And in Tudor England, food gifts were indeed one of the most commonly given gifts throughout the Tudor period. And not just necessarily for Christmas, or rather New Year's Day, when traditionally the Christmas exchange of presents took place. But it was really just like today's obligatory box of chocolates or the bottle of wine, which is still recognized and often welcome token of appreciation. But this exchange of food gifts on New Year's Day in Tudor England was a much practiced means of maintaining relationships. Quite interesting, actually, the whole topic. So, not we mustn't forget, not everybody was literate, but this form of gift exchange helped to sustain a sense of community and respect across all levels of society. But this could also backfire if you got it wrong, as food gifting was really truly an art form, and gifting the wrong food was highly offensive, which I think is just hilarious, but different times. We can, funny enough, also observe a slight change in what gifts were given on New Year's Day, especially high status food. In the beginning, so we're talking Henry VII, Henry VIII, we witness a clear bulk of, surprise, surprise, meat and fish being gifted. But towards the close of the century, there is a noticeable change to giving fresh and preserved fruit, sugar, and sugar-based treats like marchpane, marmalade, and fruit tarts. And as we know, even Elizabeth was a lucky recipient of marchpane and marmalades. Almost at every New Year's gift giving session, she even got somebody to take notes on who gave what and how good it was. And most of them she kept, especially those made by her own pastry chef. But the fun fact is in 1575, she instantly re-gifted a marmalade given by someone known as just Hampton. So we don't know whether it was a man or a Mrs., but we know it was either Mr. or Mrs. Hampton. And that obviously doesn't appeal enough to her. So she gifted it to Mrs. Skidmore. And that's all in the accountant books, which is just wonderful. I often wonder on what grounds that marmalade failed so miserably, but must have been the expiry date. Yeah, but she also received peaches. She's definitely enjoyed having a box of peaches. Um, but yeah, very common. And other food gifts included cheese, gammon pie, mutton, goose, pheasant. So we see all sorts of food being gifted on New Year's Day, and obviously then also served up at the various tables. Yeah.
What could we expect to see at a 12th night banquet? Did they celebrate the end of 12th night?
Right, yeah. 12th night was the absolute highlight of all the Christmastide festivities. And this fell on the night before Epiphany, so the Epiphany being the January the 6th. So the night before, that's when 12th night came in. And on this evening, iconic Tudor Christmas food were consumed. And some, more specifically, the 12th night cake. Now, 12th night cake, which was named after clearly the final day of the celebrations. And this type of cake was kind of sweetbread, a little bit like our panettone, with spices and dried fruit, but sadly, no original recipe from the 16th century survives. And we really have to go by contrived contemporary descriptions. And there is one recipe from 1647 by Eleanor Fettiplace that comes pretty close and we can work with. But we mustn't forget that in Tudor England, the only raising agent known was yeast. Hence, all so-called Tudor cakes are really a kind of sweetbread and not at all the cake consistency we would imagine. Now, I found that some people, some historians even, do mix up the 12th night cake with the bean cake. Now, the two are not interchangeable. There are two entirely different type of cakes. The bean cake, much mentioned in medieval times, is actually one of the oldest culinary Christmas traditions. But it appears to have somewhat fallen out of flavor earlier in the 16th century, because the significance of that bean cake and the bean and the pea that is actually hidden inside had to be explained in a speech made to Queen Elizabeth at Sudeley Castle in 1592, which to me, a food historian, is actually super interesting. She did not know about this particular tradition to hide the bean and the pea in the bean cake, and whoever found it in the slice they were given was then basically the king and the queen for all the time the festivities lasted. We are pretty certain also that the bean cake was more like a ginger cake, so had lots of ginger in it, and therefore was on occasion referred to as pepper cake. And I think that says a lot, what sort of taste and flavor you would expect by eating the bean cake. There is actually one accountancy book that's quite interesting. It's from Ingerstone Hall in Essex, where Sir William Petrie entertained his 12th night guests on January the 6th in 1552 with his specially baked spicy fruit cake containing a bean and a pea for the king and the queen of the revels. So there it is being mentioned, but by the time Elizabeth visits Sudeley Castle in 1592, she seems to be unaware of it. So we don't know whether she was just detached from real fun activities or whether they felt it might be interesting for her to know. We will never know. But Twelfth Night is also famous for the wassailing drink and lamb's wool drink. Both are communal drinking practices. And one tradition is believed to go back to Tudor times. That also seems to really enjoy a very recent resurgence in modern England. We hear more and more wassailing activities going on January the 6th. Now, several Tudor documents do refer to the custom of wassail as a warm spiced drink made from ale, being carried in a special wassail bowl by the ladies of the house. So good? No queries. Now, the best description of that sort of custom being celebrated is by the Londoner Henry Machin, who on 12th Eve in 1555 witnessed such a particularly lavish wassailing celebration in Henley-on-Thames after supper. So we know it definitely was something that was happening indoors in big houses. But here comes the interesting thing. The practice of taking the wassail bowl into the orchard on the eve of Epiphany was not as common then as we would like to think, and might prove to be a pivotal point by which the ale drink might have started to have lamb's wool added to it. Now, you probably have heard of lamb's wool. Lamb's wool is the cider version. So we have the real wassailing using ale and lamb's wool using the apple product, which is cider. And this custom of taking a bowl of this drink into the orchards, the earliest mention, the earliest evidence was actually found by a friend of mine, Dr. Joanna Crosby, who was able to find evidence of this happening in January 1577 in the town of Fordich in Kent. Now, it is, of course, quite possible that this tradition developed from just small groups of lower ranking class visiting the bigger houses in hope of a cup of wassail, possibly some food and money. And because carol singing was also closely bound up with this custom of taking the wassail bowl from house to house, begging for gifts, food, and drink, it could just be that this practice uh, started to be taken out onto the street um, by the farming communities sometime after the mid 16th century. But this really only took off in the 17th century, as another writer, Robert Herrick, describes this practice of wassailing around the trees in 1648. So to me, the food historian, it just sounds somehow like it's a development from kind of jump from the posh domestic event to this jolly all singing and dancing common affair in the orchard, as it seems to be lost to us, the origin, how it just changed. And I think concluding, we can say that at least by the 17th century, the presumption is that the drink was not wine, but ale or cider. And although no complete Tudor period wassail recipe as such has survived, a range of original documents have helped to piece together the list of ingredients, which are, as I just mentioned before, either ale or cider, and mixed in sugar, nutmeg, ginger, and if you want, put some little apples floating on top.
Towards the end of the podcast, I like to ask my guests 5 fun history questions. So, firstly, have you got a history pet peeve?
Ah, too many. But I think my favorite one is the myth that spices were used to cover up rotten meat. Absolute nonsense. Spices were extremely expensive, and nobody would have wasted them on covering up rotten meat.
No, that's such a waste, just chuck the meat.
Exactly, exactly.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
Ah, there is only one, and it would be Sir Edward Chamberlain. Now, Sir Edward Chamberlain was the very man who built my home in around 1500, and I certainly would want to invite him and ask him what his favorite food was.
Have you got a favorite book? It can be fiction, non-fiction, or both.
Right, I actually have two. They are non-fiction, and in fact, they are, well, what we now consider collector's items. The first book I was given for my 50th birthday, it is a 1580 copy by Thomas Tasser of his 500 Points of Good Husbandry, which I constantly refer to and I work with on almost a daily basis. And the other one was given to me by my husband just a few months ago for my 60th birthday, which is a 1593 edition of Thomas Hill's Profitable Art of Gardening. And again, I have used this as a source to establish my own Tudor garden.
Wow, what amazing books. You're so lucky.
Yeah, you have to get to my age to be deserving of books like that. There must be something good about getting so old.
If you could go back in time to any event or day in history, when would it be and why?
Yeah, it would have to be the 7th of July, 1541, to be able to witness the last will written for Sir Edward, because I would like to know more than anything what the man looked like who built my home.
Have you got a favourite historical fact?
Oh, yes, I do. And again, it is about my Sir Edward, because my Sir Edward Chamberlain was or happened to be the assistant to Sir Edmund Bedingfield, the steward who looked after Catherine of Aragon at Kimbolton Castle at the time of her death. So there is the only royal connection in that way. Yeah, and it's a recent discovery of mine, and I'm dead impressed that he actually did that he was able to be there.
You need to write a book about Sir Edward, I think.
Oh, it's going to be my PhD thesis. The whole family. Nobody has written about them before yet. They are extraordinarily interesting, but have somehow escaped under the radar. So, yeah, my PhD is about that particular family and how we can read history and how it changed, everyday life through just through the prism of one family.
Thank you so much for coming on today. And to be honest, you've educated me a lot on Tudor food today.
Well, it was a pleasure, and thank you so much for having invited me.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.